This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the best way to make an amazing website. We finally got our high-end 2020 iMac with the 10-core CPU and the 5700 XT graphics card late last week, and now it's time to put it through its paces, comparing it to everything from the iMac Pro, our $15,000 Mac Pro, and of course, the high-end 16-inch MacBook Pro with the powerful 5600M graphics, which is what this video is all about. Now, we already compared the lower spec 2020 iMac to the base 16-inch MacBook Pro, and in that video, we compared things like the ports, the speakers, the displays, the convenience of portability with the MacBook, the microphones, and the webcams. So definitely check out that video if you're interested in those differences. But in this video, it's all about performance to help you decide which Mac you should buy. Here are the specs of both machines, and as you can see, the MacBook Pro is quite a bit more expensive, but it does come with the 1TB SSD, which is a nice bonus. And on the other hand, we loaded the iMac up with 64 gigs of RAM for only $250 from Amazon, since it's so much cheaper than Apple's $1,000 upgrade price, and it literally only takes a minute to do it yourself. So if you end up choosing the iMac, absolutely upgrade the RAM yourself, and you can find links to the best deals on RAM down in the description below. Now, before we get into the performance, I want to mention that the iMac benefits from a better cooling system, double the RAM, 2 more CPU cores, and double the graphics VRAM, which runs at the same 394 GB per second bandwidth as the super fast HBM2 in the 5600M graphics on this 16-inch MacBook Pro. Starting with Geekbench 5 CPU test, the iMac has about 15% more single-core performance, but a very impressive 32% higher multi-core score. So it definitely has a huge advantage there, but that's just raw performance. In the Cinebench R20 stress test, which factors in the cooling systems, there was an even bigger difference, with the iMac being a huge 60% more powerful, showing the advantage of the much larger cooling system. So even though the iMac isn't portable like the MacBook Pro, that 60% difference in heavy workloads could be worth it for a lot of people. Now, moving on to graphics benchmarks, we tested raw graphics performance using Geekbench 5's Metal test, and the iMac's 5700 XT was about 34% more powerful than the MacBook's 5600M, which is actually still impressive, being faster than the 5500 XT card in the $2,300 iMac. Moving on to gaming performance using Unigen's Heaven benchmark on the Extreme preset, the iMac got around 20 more FPS, and it performed very well when we played a couple of games under Windows 10 using Boot Camp in our gaming review of the iMac. So definitely check that video out if you're interested. Now, since Unigen uses OpenGL, we also ran some Metal-based benchmarks using GFX Bench Metal 5.0. In the 1440p Aztec Ruins test, the iMac was 42% more powerful than the MacBook Pro, and in the Manhattan test, the iMac scored an even bigger 46% more than the 5600M in the MacBook, so it looks like it's even better for Metal-based benchmarks. But as we all know, benchmarks don't tell us the full story, not at all, as you're about to see in the real-world tests. But before we get into those, let me give a huge shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you've been thinking about making your own website, Squarespace is seriously the best way to go. I built an engaging website for my wife's cleaning business with literally no webmaking experience. You just choose a template, customize blocks of text and images, and easily move them around. It's incredibly simple, affordable, and it's been running flawlessly for almost 2 years, bringing in new clients thanks to its built-in SEO tools. So whether you're making a website for a small business or for literally anything else, go to squarespace.com for a free trial and use our custom link below when you're ready to launch to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. Getting back to those real-world tests, we're going to start off with photo editing using Lightroom Classic. We exported 500 raw 42 megapixel photos on both machines, and to our surprise, the MacBook Pro kept up very well, only taking a couple more minutes to export all of those photos. So while the iMac is faster for photo exporting, it's not that big of a difference. Now, our MacBook Pro is loaded with 32 GB of RAM and that's incredibly important for photo editing, as we discovered in our How Much RAM Do You Need for Macs in 2020 video. We used the 2020 iMac, and simply going from 16 to 32 gigs of RAM saved us over 4 minutes in this test, so it seems like RAM is the most important factor for photo editing. Now before we get into video editing with Final Cut Pro 10, where we saw the most surprising results, let's first show off the results from the new Logic Pro 10 benchmark for music producers. The high-end iMac with the 10-core CPU was able to handle a pretty impressive 131 tracks being played at the same time, compared to 97 tracks with the MacBook Pro. That's 35% more performance for music production. We also tested one of the older versions of Blender, which uses the graphics to render the BMW and Classroom tests, and the iMac finished about 5 minutes quicker, which we think benefits from running at higher clock speeds. Now let's finally get into video editing, starting with the Bruce X 5K benchmark in Final Cut Pro 10. Here, it was surprising to see that there was literally no difference at all. The MacBook Pro was able to finish the test in the exact same 9 seconds, possibly due to the HBM2 memory. And then moving on to our 1-minute 4K HEVC stabilization test, the iMac finished around 2.5 seconds faster, which doesn't sound like much, but it's still a 25% improvement, which could add up over time. Now moving on to our export tests, we exported a 5-minute 4K H.264 clip with added effects, which is the most common format that YouTubers use. And to our surprise, the 16-inch MacBook Pro actually finished a couple of seconds faster. The main reason for that is because these machines aren't limited by the CPU or the graphics in this specific test. They're actually both using the same integrated UHD Graphics 630 chip with QuickSync technology to encode, so that small difference might be due to the 5700 XT not being quite as optimized. Now exporting a 5-minute HEVC clip, the iMac is surprisingly slower, once again, by 13 seconds this time, which is a bit disappointing considering the huge difference in raw performance we saw earlier. But this test is also not dependent on raw performance. HEVC footage is actually taken care of by Apple's T2 chip and the hardware accelerators in the Navi-based graphics. The important thing to note is that last year's iMac that lacked both of those things took much longer in this test, over 6 minutes, compared to the new 2-minute and 42-second time, so it's definitely a huge improvement. But as for why the iMac is slower than the MacBook, we think it's because the iMac is incorrectly using QuickSync to export instead of using the T2 chip like the MacBook Pro is using. So it seems like Final Cut is still telling the iMac to use QuickSync for this codec, since last year's iMac didn't have those new hardware accelerators. But we are expecting Final Cut Pro to be updated very soon to start using the Navi-based accelerators that can encode 8-bit HEVC at up to 90 frames per second instead of 60 using the T2 chip, so the iMac should either match the MacBook Pro or outperform it when that update gets released. Now finally moving on to some heavier raw codecs, this is where the iMac starts to shine. In the 5-minute C200 raw export test, the iMac finished over a minute faster because this test is very graphics dependent, which gives the iMac an advantage. But then moving on to exporting a 5-minute 4.5K red raw clip, the iMac blows the MacBook Pro out of the water because this codec is dependent on both the CPU and graphics power. And then exporting a 1-minute 8K red raw clip, we see an even bigger difference, with the iMac finishing almost 3 times as fast as the MacBook Pro, which could be due to the fact that this codec is tough on VRAM, and the iMac has 16 gigs of memory compared to 8 gigs on the MacBook Pro. We also decided to run a couple of video editing tests in Davinci Resolve 16 Studio, starting with a Blackmagic RAW 6K to UHD export test. Here, the iMac Pro blew the MacBook Pro out of the water once again, finishing over a minute quicker, which is huge for that codec. And the main reason why is because this footage is very heavily dependent on graphics and VRAM. With the MacBook Pro, we noticed that while running this test, the 8 gigs of VRAM was completely maxed out, and that was actually the major bottleneck. So the 16 gigs of VRAM on the iMac's 5700 XT graphics allowed it to run this test much quicker. And now moving on to our final test, temporal and spatial noise reduction using Blackmagic raw footage. Here, we basically see a 30% improvement for the iMac, which basically matches up to the 34% improvement in raw graphics power that we saw using Geekbench 5's metal test. So now with all of that out of the way, let's finish up with some conclusions we can pull from all of these tests before we get into recommending which Mac you should buy. We were surprised by how well the MacBook Pro kept up with the iMac and even beat it in some video editing tests. This is mainly because of that high-end, super fast 5600M graphics. And if Apple didn't just release it, and we were instead testing with the previous best 5500M graphics, then the iMac would have smoked it. The 5600M uses basically the same 40-core graphics chip as the 5700 XT, but it's simply running on less watts compared to the iMac, which isn't battery powered. But in general, there were mainly two things that caused the iMac to perform much better in some of these tests. One of them was the fact that the 5700 XT graphics card has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which we noticed was the bottleneck on the MacBook Pro with only having 8 gigs for the heavier tests, especially for certain raw codecs. But keep in mind that only the 5700 XT option on the 2020 iMac has 16 gigs of VRAM. All of the other options have 8 gigs or less, which will be slower than the MacBook Pro in most tests. Now the second thing was the drastic difference in processing power with that 10-core CPU, coupled with the much better cooling system that allows it to keep the clock speeds higher than on the MacBook Pro. Both of these things made a huge difference for heavy-hitting codecs like raw footage, so the iMac is obviously the better choice for things like that if you're looking purely at performance differences, especially since the iMac is actually quite a bit cheaper than the 5600M 16-inch MacBook Pro. However, the MacBook also packs the same T2 chip and Navi-based hardware accelerators as the iMac, which allow it to perform the same or even slightly better than the iMac for lower-end work, like regular 4K H.264 editing or dealing with 4K HEVC footage, which is becoming increasingly more common. So if you're just doing basic 4K editing and you're not dealing with heavy raw codecs, the MacBook Pro is actually a great choice, and the same thing goes for photo editors, where the performance difference was surprisingly small. Now let's finish up with which models you guys should buy. If you think you'd enjoy the portability of the MacBook Pro, then just buy the MacBook Pro, because it still performs quite well compared to this high-end iMac, especially for common video editing tasks and things like photo editing. But if you want the most performance you can get for the least amount of cash, the iMac is actually a much better choice, since you can upgrade the RAM yourself and save around $550 compared to this high-end MacBook Pro, and you also get a larger display. And then you end up getting much better performance for higher-end codecs like raw footage, you'll get better performance for Logic Pro music production, you'll get 16 gigs of VRAM, you'll get quite a bit better gaming performance, and I'm fairly certain that performance should improve for common tasks when the iMac finally starts getting optimized. Now the biggest question is whether you should actually upgrade to the 10-core CPU on the iMac, or just stick to the 8-core. Now we've been comparing the two and getting very interesting results, so if you want to see that comparison video, definitely click the circle above to subscribe, and if this video helps you guys out, definitely check out our Apple product merch down below, including our new Apple product mask, which comes with black icons and white icons in a variety of different colors. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.